Dorothy Whitman thought she was dying alone in a Phoenix homeless shelter. What her adopted son Jake didn't know was that the woman he'd just thrown out of her own house was secretly worth $9.5 million. And the way she made that money, it would destroy everything he thought he knew about his mother. 3 days after kicking her out, Jake would receive a phone call that would change his life forever. But by then, Dorothy would already be dead. And the truth about what she'd been hiding in that house would turn a family tragedy into a federal investigation. What Jake found in his mother's basement wasn't just money. It was evidence of something so twisted, so calculated, that investigators are still trying to piece together how one woman fooled an entire city for over 2 decades. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here and you love deep dive true crime stories that'll keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to uncover one of the most shocking cases of family betrayal you've ever.
The story I'm about to tell you happened in Scottsdale, Arizona, in one of those pristine suburban neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business. Or at least they think they do. She lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house in Paradise Valley, the kind of place where million-dollar homes are considered modest. Jake's biological parents had died in a horrific car crash up in Flagstaff, leaving him with no family, no one to turn to. Dorothy stepped in like an angel, promising to give this traumatized little boy the loving home he deserved. He remembered nights when Dorothy would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills, her head in her hands, whispering about how she didn't know how they'd make it through another month. He remembered her working late into the night, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her tired face as she balanced other people as books to keep food on their table. But Dorothy wasn't wealthy. At least, that's what everyone believed. Dorothy Whitman was 58 years old when her world came crashing down. Dorothy would get calls at 3 in the morning, and she'd take them. Not just answer and hang up, but have full conversations, sometimes for hours. When Jake asked who was calling so late, Dorothy would claim it was clients on the East Coast dealing with emergency bookkeeping issues. She'd moved to Scottsdale in 1998, right after adopting 7-year-old Jake from the Arizona foster care system. She worked as a freelance bookkeeper from home, always complaining about money troubles, always worried about making ends meet. Jake had been living with Dorothy for almost a year, and the strange behavior was getting worse. The mysterious packages, the late-night phone calls, the locked office, the bank statements that arrived and immediately disappeared into that locked filing cabinet. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day, packages would arrive at their house. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a normal evening between a mother and her adult son. Dorothy always made sure to be home when they were delivered, and she'd immediately take them to her home office, which she kept locked at all times. She drove a beat-up 2007 Honda Civic, shopped at thrift stores, and clipped coupons like her life depended on it. For 18 years, Dorothy played the role of the struggling single mother perfectly. He was broken, financially devastated, and desperate for his mother's support. What's in all those packages that keep arriving? She didn't turn around, just kept stirring the pasta sauce, but Jake could see her shoulders tense. Dorothy welcomed him with open arms, just like she always had. Jake pressed. "You've never told me about any medical condition." "Medical supplies. For my condition." But Jake wasn't the same trusting child who'd once believed every word his mother said. Jake grew up believing they were barely scraping by. But here's what Jake didn't know. What nobody in Paradise Valley knew. Dorothy Whitman had been living a double life for over 20 years. And the sweet, struggling single mother who volunteered at the local food bank and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries was actually one of the most successful con artists in Arizona history. Something cold, something calculating, something that made his blood run cold. The first crack in Dorothy's perfect facade appeared in early 2023, when 25-year-old Jake moved back home after his divorce. Strange things that didn't add up. Jake started noticing things almost immediately. First, there were the phone calls. Nobody has bookkeeping emergencies at 3 a.m., but Jake had worked with bookkeepers before. Then there were the packages. "Medical supplies," she'd tell Jake when he asked. "For my diabetes." But Jake knew his mother didn't have diabetes. She'd never had diabetes. In fact, Dorothy was healthier than most people half her age. The breaking point came on March 15th, 2024. Jake confronted her in the kitchen that evening. It was 7:30 p.m., and Dorothy was making dinner, humming to herself like she always did. "Mom, I need to ask you something," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. Dorothy's humming stopped. "I told you, sweetheart, what condition?" That's when Dorothy turned around, and for just a moment, Jake saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. "You're being paranoid, Jake," she said, her voice still sweet, but with an edge he'd never heard before. "Maybe you should focus on getting your own life together instead of prying into mine." Dorothy accused him of being ungrateful, of always being a burden, of never appreciating the sacrifices she'd made for him. The argument escalated from there. Jake demanded to know about the packages, the phone calls, the locked office. "I gave you everything," she screamed, slamming the wooden spoon down on the counter. "I took you in when nobody else wanted you. I raised you, I fed you, I put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me, by accusing me of lying? It's not normal, Mom." When she spoke again, her voice was calm, controlled, terrifying in its coldness. Jake was stunned. In all his years with Dorothy, he'd never seen her lose control like this. She'd always been patient, understanding, loving. The next morning, after Dorothy left for one of her mysterious medical appointments, he broke into her home office. This woman standing in front of him felt like a stranger. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Jake said quietly. "I'm just worried about you. These phone calls, the packages, the secrecy, name after name, account after account, all with Dorothy Whitman listed as the primary account holder. Just from the statements he could find, Dorothy had access to over $2 million. $2 million that she'd been hiding while claiming they were about to lose their home. He spread the bank statements across the kitchen table and waited for her to come home. "I didn't want to tell you, but since you're so determined to know my business, there it is." She saw the papers on the table and stopped dead in her tracks. These were statements showing account balances in the hundreds of thousands, multiple accounts, multiple banks, all under Dorothy's name, but with business names Jake had never heard of. "We're both going to be homeless by the end of the week." Dorothy stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see something shifting behind her eyes. "Explain to me what the Helping Hands Children's Foundation is. Explain to me why you've been lying to me my entire life." "I've been lying about a lot of things. Now pack your things and get out. You have $2 million in these accounts, and you told me we were going to be homeless. You have 48 hours to find somewhere else to live," she said. "I'm losing the house. Foreclosure." Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't the warm, loving smile he'd known his whole life. It was cold, predatory, victorious. "What? How was that possible? You said the mortgage was almost paid off." "I lied," Dorothy said simply, but Jake wasn't willing to let it go. What he found there would change everything. The locked filing cabinet contained bank statements. Lots of them, but not the kind of statements you'd expect from a struggling single mother. Helping Hands Children's Foundation, Veterans Support Network, Arizona Senior Care Alliance. Jake's hands were shaking as he added up the numbers. That evening, Jake confronted Dorothy with the evidence. She walked in at 7:30 p.m., just like always. "Interesting reading material," she said, her voice eerily calm. $2 million, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dorothy sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap like she was about to have a pleasant conversation about the weather. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Jake," she said, "and you never will." "Try me," Jake shot back. "Explain to me how you have $2 million while working as a freelance bookkeeper." Dorothy smiled then, and it was the most terrifying thing Jake had ever seen. "The only thing I need to explain to you," she said, "is that you need to be out of this house by tomorrow morning. And if you ever mention those account numbers to anyone, if you ever try to cause trouble for me, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short life." Jake stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm not threatening you, sweetheart," Dorothy said, standing up and collecting the bank statements. "I'm promising you. You have no idea what I'm capable of. What I've done to people who got in my way." He kept telling himself that Dorothy was just scared, that she'd calm down, and they'd work it out. But when he came back the next morning to get his things, he found the locks had been changed. "What I'll do to you if you don't disappear and forget everything you've seen." Jake left the house that night and stayed at a friend's place. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Jake's voice came out as a croak. "What did she tell you?" His belongings were sitting in garbage bags on the front lawn. Dorothy's car was gone. The house looked empty. She was a master manipulator who'd been playing a game that Jake was only beginning to understand. Jake pounded on the door, called Dorothy's phone, even asked the neighbors if they'd seen her. She was sobbing, shaking, barely able to speak. She claimed she was fleeing from an abusive adopted son who'd been stealing her money and threatening to kill her. She arrived in the middle of the night, carrying only a small suitcase and wearing clothes that looked like they'd been through a washing machine too many times. She'd practiced her story, perfected her performance, and calculated every detail to make herself appear as sympathetic as possible. "I had no idea you were capable of such violence." She was terrified to give us her real name at first, convinced that her son would track her down and hurt her. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who lived next door, pulled Jake aside with a concerned expression. She'd befriended Jennifer specifically because Jennifer had recently inherited a small life insurance payout from her deceased mother. "I'm so sorry about your mother," she said quietly. "She told me what you did to her." "What?" She offered to help with the shelter's bookkeeping, organizing their chaotic financial records for free. She listened to other residents' stories with genuine compassion and offered comfort to women who were dealing with their own traumas. "About the abuse," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice full of sympathy for Dorothy. "She showed me the bruises, Jake. She was terrified of you. She'd help watch the kids, share her food, give advice. She seemed like the sweetest person in the world. She said she had to flee in the middle of the night because she was afraid you were going to kill her. If Jake tried to tell anyone about the bank accounts, about the money, who would believe him? The violent son who'd beaten his poor mother so badly that she had to flee her own home." Jake realized then that Dorothy had been planning this. She'd been telling the neighbors that Jake was abusive, setting up her story in advance. Dorothy Whitman was more than just a con artist. 3 days after Dorothy disappeared from her Scottsdale home, she showed up at Hope Haven Shelter in downtown Phoenix. The intake worker, Maria Santos, later told investigators that Dorothy was one of the most heartbreaking cases she'd ever seen. She had bruises, Maria remembered, on her arms, her face. Of course, what Maria didn't know was that Dorothy had given herself those bruises. At Hope Haven, Dorothy quickly became everyone's favorite resident. She was quiet, polite, and incredibly helpful. "She was like a mother to all of us," said Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old resident who'd been staying at the shelter with her 2 young children. But Dorothy wasn't just being kind. She was studying everyone, learning their stories, figuring out how to use their vulnerabilities to her advantage. She befriended Jennifer specifically because Jennifer had recently inherited a small life insurance payout from her deceased mother. Within 2 weeks, Dorothy had convinced Jennifer to invest $3,000 of that inheritance in a fake charity that Dorothy claimed would help other homeless women get back on their feet. Jennifer, who trusted Dorothy completely, handed over the money without question. She stole over $8,000 from women who had absolutely nothing, women who were already at the lowest point in their lives. Dorothy pulled similar scams on 3 other residents, taking advantage of their desperation and her position as the shelter's unofficial mother figure. The cruel irony was that Dorothy was conducting these scams while sitting on millions of dollars. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't broke. She was just addicted to the thrill of the con, the rush of manipulating people, the satisfaction of taking what didn't belong to her. She'd been complaining of feeling tired and having trouble breathing, but everyone assumed it was just stress from her traumatic situation. When she hit the floor, gasping for air and turning blue, the other residents screamed for help. But Dorothy's luck was about to run out. On March 25, 2024, Dorothy collapsed during dinner at the shelter. Her condition was critical, and she needed immediate intensive care. Dorothy Whitman, who'd spent her entire adult life scamming people out of their money, was now dying alone in a hospital bed, with no one to claim her but the adopted son she'd betrayed and abandoned. After everything Dorothy had done, after the lies and the manipulation and the threats, why should he care if she was in the hospital? But something in the nurse's voice told him this was serious. If you want to see her, you need to come now. Part of him hoped Dorothy would be gone by the time he got there, that he wouldn't have to face her again. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the woman who'd raised him, who tucked him in at night, she looked tiny in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that were keeping her alive. For a moment, Jake forgot about the bank statements and the lies and the threats. She just looked like his mother, sick and scared and alone, and helped him with his homework, needed to see her one more time. He was staying at a cheap motel in Tempe, trying to figure out how to rebuild his life after Dorothy's betrayal. The last thing he expected was a call from Phoenix General Hospital. Jake asked, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. She was rushed to Phoenix General Hospital, where doctors discovered that Dorothy had developed severe pneumonia. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant for any of this to happen." The irony was devastating. Jake's phone rang at 6:15 a.m. on March 28, 2024. She pulled out a small silver key and pressed it into Jake's hand. "Is this Jake Whitman?" the voice asked. "We have your mother here, Dorothy Whitman. She's listed you as her emergency contact." Jake's first instinct was to hang up. "She's dying," the nurse said simply. "She's been asking for you." Jake drove to the hospital in a daze. Dorothy was barely conscious when Jake walked into ICU room 314. "Jake," she whispered when she saw him. "You came." "I'm here," Jake said, sitting down beside her bed. "I'm here, Mom." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Find out what?" Dorothy struggled to reach into the bedside table drawer. "Storage unit 247, she whispered. "Desert Springs storage on Camelback Road. Everything is there. Everything you need to understand." Jake stared at the key. "Understand what?" "Who I really am," Dorothy said. "What I've done. Why I did it." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "I loved you, Jake." Jake was pushed aside as they worked to stabilize her. Her last words were barely audible. "I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry." He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions about what Dorothy had meant, what he was going to find in that storage unit. That part was real. Jake's hands were shaking as he inserted the key and rolled up the metal door. Everything else was a lie, but that part was real. "Mom, you're scaring me," Jake said. "What are you talking about?" But Dorothy was fading. The machines around her bed were beeping more urgently, and nurses were rushing into the room. Dorothy died at 11:47 p.m. that night. Jake was alone with her when it happened, holding her hand as the life left her body, showing account balances that totaled not $2 million, but $9.5 million. Accounts spread across 23 different banks under 14 different fake charity names. She'd been running fake charities for over 20 years, targeting elderly victims across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. Her method was simple but devastatingly effective. The next morning, Jake drove to Desert Springs Storage. She'd use emotional manipulation, telling heart-wrenching stories about dying children who needed medical treatment or homeless veterans who needed food and shelter. The average loss per victim was $630, but some had given much more. Jake found records of victims who donated their entire life savings, believing they were helping children with cancer or veterans in need. She'd ask for donations of $50 to $500, amounts that wouldn't trigger major investigations, but would add up to enormous sums over time. She'd hit the same victims multiple times, sometimes calling them back months later with new sob stories. Eleanor Thompson, an 82-year-old woman from Tucson, had donated her entire life savings of $4,200 to Dorothy's fake Children as Cancer Foundation. As Jake dug deeper into Dorothy's files, he uncovered something even more horrifying. Eleanor had been living on Social Security, barely making ends meet. But she'd given everything she had because she believed she was saving the life of a 6-year-old girl with leukemia. Jake found a copy of her obituary in Dorothy's files, along with a handwritten note. Target deceased. Removed from call list. Storage unit 247 was in the back of the facility, away from the main office. What he found inside made him physically sick. The unit was packed floor to ceiling with boxes. 47 boxes, each one carefully labeled with dates and codes. There were also 3 laptops, 15 external hard drives, and a large wall safe that Jake didn't have the combination to. But it was the contents of the first box that made Jake realize his entire life had been built on a lie. She'd been running one of the most successful charity fraud operations in American history. Bank statements. Hundreds of them. Jake sank to his knees in that storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of his mother's crimes, and realized that Dorothy Whitman hadn't just been lying to him. Jake spent the next 3 days going through the contents of that storage unit, and with each box he opened, the horror grew deeper. The laptops contained detailed records of Dorothy's operations. Dorothy would call elderly people, claiming to represent legitimate charities like the American Cancer Society or Wounded Warrior Project. The genius of Dorothy's operation was that she kept the individual amounts small. Jake found spreadsheets with over 15,000 names on them. 15,000 elderly people who'd been scammed by his mother. One case file made Jake physically ill. Eleanor died 3 months later, unable to afford her heart medication. But the charity fraud was just the beginning. As Jake dug deeper into Dorothy's files, he uncovered something even more horrifying. In a folder labeled Personal, Jake found documents related to his own adoption. But these weren't the standard adoption papers he'd seen before. These were surveillance reports, medical records, and photographs of Jake and his biological parents taken months before the car crash that killed them. Dorothy had been watching Jake's family long before the adoption. The same make and model as the car Jake's parents had been driving when they died. The photos showed brake lines that had been cut, brake fluid stains on the ground, and close-up shots of the car's undercarriage. She'd murdered his parents, and then swooped in to rescue him, creating the perfect cover story for her criminal activities. Who would suspect a struggling single mother who generously adopted orphaned child? She'd been planning to take Jake even while his parents were still alive. And the car crash that killed them? Jake found evidence that suggested it wasn't an accident at all. Special Agent Lisa Morrison from the Phoenix Field Office took one look at Jake as evidence and immediately launched a multi-state investigation. Hidden in one of the laptops was a folder containing photos of a silver sedan with Arizona plates. She'd used Jake's tragic backstory to gain the trust of her victims, playing the role of the selfless woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise someone else's child. As the FBI investigation expanded, they discovered that Dorothy had been linked to at least 6 other suspicious deaths over the years. Elderly victims who'd discovered her scams and threatened to expose her. The woman who'd raised him, who'd read him bedtime stories and helped him with his homework, had been murdering people for decades. People who died in accidents that were starting to look less and less accidental. It made her charity pitches more believable, more sympathetic. Meeting them was the most difficult thing Jake had ever done. Jake realized with growing horror that Dorothy hadn't just adopted him out of kindness. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $9.5 million, but the true cost was immeasurable. His entire life, his identity, his relationship with the woman he called mother, all of it had been built on lies and murder. The adoption had been part of Dorothy's long-term plan. Thomas had been so moved by Dorothy's stories that he started volunteering at a local children's hospital, wanting to do even more to help. He'd worked there for 3 years before Dorothy's arrest, never knowing that the dying children he'd been told about didn't exist. He'd been living on food stamps for months, believing his sacrifice was helping other veterans get the medical care they needed. Margaret had been saving that money for her own funeral, not wanting to burden her family with the costs. She died 2 years later, and her children had to take out loans to pay for her burial. Jake had been nothing more than a prop in Dorothy's elaborate con game. Your mother was a master manipulator who fooled thousands of people over 2 decades. We're talking about a total fraud amount that could exceed $15 million. The final piece of the puzzle came when Jake contacted the FBI. This is one of the most sophisticated charity fraud operations we've ever seen, Agent Morrison told Jake. But the charity fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. Jake realized that he'd been living with a serial killer. The FBI's investigation into Dorothy Whitman's crimes would eventually identify 15,247 victims across 3 states. Agent Morrison introduced Jake to some of the victims, hoping their stories would help with the investigation. There was Robert Chun, a 78-year-old Korean War veteran from Albuquerque who donated his entire disability check to Dorothy's fake veterans charity. There was Margaret O'Brien, a 85-year-old grandmother from Colorado Springs who given Dorothy $2,800 to help children with cancer. And there was Thomas Rivera, a 73-year-old retired teacher from Phoenix, who'd donated over $5,000 to Dorothy's various fake charities. Thomas had been so moved by Dorothy's stories that he started volunteering at a local children's hospital, wanting to do even more to help. He'd worked there for 3 years before Dorothy's arrest, never knowing that the dying children he'd been told about didn't exist. These people had trusted Dorothy because they believed in her story, the story of the selfless single mother who'd adopted an orphaned child. They'd seen Jake's face in the fake charity materials. His childhood photos used to sell Dorothy's lies. Each story was a dagger to Jake's heart. Jake realized that he'd been an unwitting accomplice in his mother's crimes. His existence had made Dorothy's scams more believable, more sympathetic. People had given money thinking they were helping a woman like Dorothy, someone who'd sacrificed everything to help a child in need. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs sooner, for not stopping Dorothy before she could hurt more people. The guilt was overwhelming. Jake stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything except the endless parade of victims who'd been hurt because of his mother's lies. On April 15th, 2024, Jake attempted suicide. He should have seen the signs, should have stopped her somehow. The fact that Dorothy had murdered his biological parents to get to him made it even worse. His entire life was built on violence and lies. Some people were shocked and horrified, unable to believe that the woman they'd known as a generous volunteer and loving mother could have been capable of such evil. Others claimed they'd always suspected something was wrong with Dorothy, though none of them had ever said anything. People stared at him when he went out, whispered behind his back, wondered if he'd known about his mother's crimes all along. Some of Dorothy's victims' families blamed Jake directly, claiming he should have stopped her or at least suspected something. Jake was technically Dorothy's heir, but the property was tied up in legal proceedings that would take years to resolve. Not that Jake wanted it anyway. He couldn't bear the thought of living in the place where Dorothy had planned her crimes. She led him to a small conference room where the contents of the safe were laid out on a table. He was found by his friend Michael in a motel room in Tempe, unconscious from an overdose of sleeping pills. Photos of him playing in his biological parents' backyard, walking to school, riding his bike. Photos taken months before the car crash that killed his parents. It was clear that Dorothy had been stalking them for months, learning their patterns, planning her attack. You were a child when she adopted you. You were a victim, just like everyone else she hurt. Inside was a handwritten letter, 12 pages long, written in Dorothy's careful script. Jake had left a note. I can't live knowing that my existence helped her hurt so many people. I'm sorry. Jake survived, but just barely. He spent 2 weeks in the psychiatric ward at Phoenix General, the same hospital where Dorothy had died. The irony wasn't lost on him. During his recovery, Jake was visited by Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in helping family members of criminals cope with their guilt and trauma. You are not responsible for your mother's crimes, Dr. Williams told him, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he should have known. One contained brake fluid, the other contained metal shavings from what appeared to be brake lines. Both bags were carefully labeled with dates and locations. The community response to Dorothy's crimes was mixed. Jake became a pariah in his own neighborhood. The house in Paradise Valley was seized by the FBI as part of the investigation. The FBI investigation took 8 months to complete. In November 2024, Agent Morrison called Jake with news about the wall safe from the storage unit. We finally got it open, she said. There are some things in there that you need to see. Jake met Agent Morrison at the FBI field office in Phoenix. There were photographs of Jake as a child, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. There were also medical records for Jake's parents, including detailed information about their daily routines, their work schedules, their regular driving routes. But the most damning evidence was in 2 small plastic bags. The final item in the safe was a sealed envelope addressed to Jake. Inside was a handwritten letter, 12 pages long, written in Dorothy's careful script. My dear Jake, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I'm dead and you've discovered my secrets. I know you must hate me now, and I don't blame you. But I want you to understand why I did what I did, even if you can never forgive me. The letter was Dorothy's full confession. She admitted to murdering Jake's parents, to running the charity fraud operation, to killing at least 5 other people who'd threatened to expose her. She explained her methods, her motivations, her complete lack of remorse for anyone except Jake. Everything I did was to give you a better life. I wanted you to have opportunities that your biological parents never could have given you. She'd structured her accounts and investments to make sure Jake would get everything after her death. She'd even left detailed instructions for how Jake should handle the money, how he should help the victims, how he should try to make amends for her crimes. I wanted you to be successful, to be happy, to have everything you deserved. Maybe then you can understand that despite everything I did, despite all the lies and the pain, I truly did love you. Even from the grave, she's trying to control how I feel about her. You were the only real thing in my life, Jake, the only thing that mattered. He changed his name to Jake Morrison, taking the last name of the FBI agent who helped him through the investigation, and moved to Denver, Colorado. He's still in therapy, still struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt, but he's slowly rebuilding his life. Her methods are studied by criminal psychologists and used to train law enforcement officers. The case led to new protocols for investigating charity fraud and stricter regulations for non-profit organizations. I loved you the only way I knew how, Dorothy wrote, and potentially other criminals who might have learned from Dorothy's methods. The letter revealed that Dorothy had been planning Jake's inheritance all along. By cooperating with the FBI investigation, by giving up his inheritance, by speaking publicly about his mother's crimes, Jake helped identify dozens of other victims and potentially prevented other con artists from using similar methods. Every dollar of Dorothy's $9.5 million went to compensating the people she'd hurt, their families, and related charities that were actually helping people. The money is yours now, the letter concluded. Use it to help the people I hurt. Maybe then you can forgive me. How many other people are living double lives, hiding their true nature behind masks of love and respectability? Then he said, I'm going to give it all back, every penny. The victims deserve their money more than I do. Dorothy Whitman spent over 20 years fooling everyone around her, including the son she claimed to love. She was a master manipulator who used people's trust and compassion against them, stealing millions of dollars from vulnerable elderly victims while maintaining the perfect facade of a caring mother. Jake finished reading the letter and looked up at Agent Morrison, who'd been watching him carefully. She's still trying to manipulate me, Jake said quietly. What are you going to do? Agent Morrison asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. And that's exactly what Jake did. He worked with the FBI and the Attorney General's office to create a victim restitution fund. Jake didn't keep a single penny of his inheritance. The Dorothy Whitman case has become a textbook example of charity fraud and psychological manipulation. But perhaps the most important legacy of Dorothy's crimes is Jake's courage in coming forward. The investigation into Dorothy's crimes is still ongoing. The FBI has reopened 47 similar cases across the Southwest, looking for other victims. As for Jake, he's still trying to answer the question that haunts him every day. How many other Dorothy Whitmans are out there? The answer, unfortunately, is probably more than we'd like to believe. This case shows us that the people closest to us can hide the darkest secrets.